Is the world population expected to grow or fall in the future? Elon Musk has made several comments on this issue. He believes that global population will collapse. And because of this collapse, we are facing an existential crisis. And therefore, the future of our civilization is at risk. Elon is highlighting 2 points in his comments. The first is that world population is going to fall in the future. The second point he's making is that he believes the fall in population is bad for the planet. It's bad for the human race. But this second point is very debatable. This isn't a debate I want to get into with this video. What I want to focus on is Elon's first point. I want to assess, as objectively as possible, whether world population is expected to grow or to fall in the future. If there will be a fall, when will that happen? And why would there be a fall in world population? To answer these questions, I have reviewed the data on population growth released by the United Nations Population Division, as well as the findings in their most recent report on population projections. The UN is the world's leading authority on population statistics, and their work feeds into research conducted by many other organizations, such as the World Bank. Let's take a closer look at this data. Starting with the historical data on population growth, we can see from this chart that human population numbers have been climbing since 1950, from about 2.5 billion to 8 billion today. In fact, since Neil Armstrong became the first person on the moon, a spurious comparison that Elon will appreciate, the Earth's population has more than doubled. As we can clearly see from this green line, world population is growing, not falling. In order to evaluate whether world population will grow or fall in the future, we need to estimate what this line will look like from now until the end of the century. To do this, we need to examine the historical data for its key insights, beginning with an analysis of the changes in the rate of population growth. This will reveal something you may not have expected. The rate of population growth, so that's the year-on-year change in growth, has been falling. For example, from 1969 to 1970, the world's population grew by 2.05%. But the rate of growth in 2020 was only 0.92%. This is the first time the growth rate has dipped below 1%. We can see the growth rate has been falling very significantly over the last few decades. If we place this chart side by side with our previous chart, it's quite striking how these trends are almost the mirror opposites of each other. This takes us to our first key insight in understanding population trends. Though the world population has been rising, the rate of this growth has been falling. We must now ask the question, why? Why is the rate of growth falling? What is contributing to this fall? To answer this, we need to understand that population growth is just the difference between the numbers of people born and the numbers of people dying. This is true at a global level. If we examine population growth regionally or at country level, then we should account for migration flows as well. However, globally, if there are more births than deaths, the population grows, otherwise, it falls. With this simple equation in mind, let's look at the data on births and deaths. This chart shows us that the total number of global births and deaths have gone up. But this isn't especially meaningful as the total world population has also gone up. What we really want to know is the number of births and deaths, but controlling for population growth over the years. This means we need to adjust our equation by replacing total births and total deaths with births per 1,000 people and deaths per 1,000. You might ask, why per 1,000? It could actually be per any number, per 10, per 100,000, per 1 million. It doesn't matter so long as we account for total population numbers in some way. Per 1,000 happens to be the standard the UN uses, so we'll stick to that as well. Now, if we plot births and deaths per 1,000 people, a far more meaningful picture emerges. Let me highlight 3 important observations from this chart. Our first observation is that birth rates are higher than death rates. This explains why total world population has been growing each year. Our second observation is that the gap between births and deaths has been narrowing, and narrowing quite significantly over the years. This explains why the rate of growth has been falling. Remember, the rate of growth, as we showed with our equation, is the difference between births and deaths. And our third observation is that the death rate line in the chart is relatively flat. But the birth rates line is much steeper. This observation reveals a crucial point. The fall in the rate of growth is primarily driven by falling birth rates. Changes in birth rates are of course a reflection of changing fertility rates. So let's take a closer look at fertility rates. This chart shows the average number of births per woman across the world. Global fertility rates have fallen very significantly from about 5 births per woman in the early 1960s to about 2 births per woman today. This takes us to the second important insight we need to note when examining the historical data on population growth. The rate of growth has been falling primarily because of falling fertility rates. Now we've uncovered these two important insights about population growth. Let's return to our main question. Is the world population expected to grow or to fall in the future? In other words, what will this trend line look like in the future? The answer depends almost entirely on the projection of fertility rates. As the UN report states, when fertility begins to fall, the annual rate of growth starts to drop. Therefore, fertility will be the most important determinant of global population trends in the coming decades. We can group projections into the short term and the long term. Short-term projections are from now until 2050. Long-term projections are from 2050 to the end of the century. From now until 2050, the UN estimates that fertility rates will continue to drop, reaching an average of 2.15 births per woman. A fall in fertility rates leads to a fall in birth rates, as you can see in this chart. Birth rates are expected to fall by over 17%. Death rates are expected to rise during this period of time, but by a smaller amount, about 7%. So, the narrowing of the gap between births and deaths, as is clear from this chart, is largely attributed to falling birth rates and therefore falling fertility rates. As the gap narrows, then the rate of population growth will continue to fall. The UN expects the growth rate to reach less than 0.5% by 2050. However, as births remain higher than deaths, regardless of the falling growth rates, total world population will continue to rise. The UN believes these projections are fairly solid, with a 95% probability the Earth's population will reach 9.7 billion by the year 2050. That's a growth of 1.7 billion people. To give that some context, over the next quarter of a century, the growth of the world's population will be greater than the population of India or China, which today are the world's 2 most populous countries. What about long-term projections until the end of the century? The UN expects that fertility rates will continue to drop after 2050. By the end of the century, fertility rates will average 1.84 births per woman. A fall in fertility rates means, of course, a fall in the birth rates. We can see in this chart a narrowing of the gap between births and deaths. This narrowing eventually will lead to births dropping below deaths for the first time in the mid-2080s. This is a significant turning point in world population, as this means, for the first time, the number of people born, each year, will be less than the number of people dying. We can see the difference between births and deaths reflected as well in this chart. We can see that the rate of population growth dipping below zero and becoming negative towards the end of the century. So, what does this mean for estimates of total population numbers? In this chart, we can see that world population will peak at 10.4 billion in 2086. After this date, total population will start to decline. The UN, in their report, discussed the possibility of other long-term projections of world population, which are largely based on differing assumptions about future fertility rates. The scenario I've just shared with you is what the UN believes to be their best guess or most likely scenario. Returning to our original question, is the world population expected to grow or to fall in the future? It might seem we now have an answer. The world's population, according to the UN data, is expected to grow from now until 2050. After 2050, the world population will continue to grow, but very slowly, until it reaches a peak of 10.4 billion in the mid-2080s, after which the population will start to fall. However, there is one very important caveat we need to acknowledge with this answer to our question. These projections are just estimates, and as the UN report explicitly points out, projection of the global population is inherently uncertain. and it typically becomes more uncertain over time. Therefore, our short-term projections, that is from now until 2050, are relatively more certain than our long-term projections. In fact, on the short-term projections, the UN report states that, given that most population increase until 2050 will be driven by the momentum of past growth, further actions by governments aimed at reducing fertility would do little to slow the pace of growth between now and mid-century. So, we should expect the population projections to 2050 to very likely occur, regardless of government policy to change the course of these projections. However, the same cannot be said for long-term or long-range projections which the UN believes are highly uncertain. It is quite possible that government policy to influence changes in population growth may still have time to work. So, I'm afraid the final answer to our question isn't entirely satisfying. The world population is expected to rise, with a high degree of certainty, from now until 2050. The world population is expected to fall towards the end of the century, but there is far more uncertainty with this projection. Perhaps the most important takeaway, as we mentioned previously, is that whatever may be the final answer to our question will depend primarily upon projections of global fertility rates and therefore depend, at least in the long term, upon policy by various governments to influence changes in these rates.
Subscribe now to stay informed about our latest videos and podcasts. Our next video on country-level projections of population growth is coming soon. The slides from this video are available to purchase from our store. Details are in the description.